Well, ever since we got reports of that chemical attack in Damascus last month, there's been an intense focus on Syria, hasn't there? And lots of questions as well. So we've invited guests from BBC Russian, BBC Arabic and our diplomatic correspondent to answer questions you have about the crisis there. We're also going to be speaking to a group of Iranians around the world about those comments from President Rouhani that Iran has got no intention of developing a nuclear weapon. I wonder if you took those comments at face value. If you'd like to take part in either discussion, we're live here on the BBC. This is our phone number. We're on social media too. I'll do my best to get all your comments into the programme.
People are going to want to know.
Let's just say something.
Thank you very much indeed for joining me. We're going to start today's programme by talking about the crisis in Syria. Let me start by playing you a couple of videos that we've been sent. This is from Naji, a Syrian who's currently in Jordan.
We know that the regime's sole interest is to remain in power, even if it was stripped of its ammunition. Assad thinks of Syria as some sort of farm that he inherited from his father, and which he plans to bequeath to his son. The weakest link in this equation is the Syrian opposition, that is swaying between Arab and Western allegiances. The strongest link of all is the regime that has scored consecutive victories along with Russia, beginning with forcing protesters to bear arms, right through to transforming public demands of freedom into an international struggle over chemical weapons.
I'm very skeptical about the possibility of the opposition and the regime being able to agree on a ceasefire. I think if we just look at what just happened in Azaz, it was hard enough to secure a ceasefire between groups that were ostensibly fighting on the same side. I'm speaking very loosely here about the opposition. I'm talking about Islamic State of Iraq and Asham and FSA groups. And we have to remember that Syria here isn't a two-front war. It's not as clean as the regime fighting against the opposition. You've got Syria government forces, you've got Iranian forces, you've got Hezbollah fighting FSA, Salafis, Al-Qaeda, then you've got Iraqis fighting each other on both sides. And if you think that you can get everyone to agree to a ceasefire kind of in principle, that's already a lofty goal. Getting them to agree on the terms of a ceasefire at this point seems completely impossible.
So there we have two videos that have been sent into World Have You Say. Thank you very much indeed for them. While we were looking at those, I've been joined by three colleagues. Sergei Zakin from BBC Russian, Mamdouh Akbiek from BBC Arabic, and Jonathan Marcus, our diplomatic and defence correspondent. Well, let's first of all start with the confusion, frankly, over whether the Syrian government may or may not be interested in a ceasefire. I think a lot of people have been left rubbing their heads as to exactly what the government said, what it might want. What's your analysis of that, Jonathan?
Well, of course, what we have is a comment from the leader of a very small secular party that's allied with the Ba'athist regime in Syria. It was brought into the government to try and show a sort of a widening, an opening on the part of the Assad regime to other factions. And he did seem to indicate that if there were to be a Geneva conference, a second Geneva conference, the goal clearly would be for a ceasefire. Now, he also said very clearly that nobody could win this conflict. That's no surprise. I think that would be the view of all of us around the table and most people, expert or otherwise, around the world. But whether this was some kind of trial balloon for the Assad regime, they very quickly come back and said, no, 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 that's not what they want. What I feel it might be is just part of this positioning of the Syrian regime and the Russians. You know, they want to present themselves as the ones willing to come to the table, willing to talk. They're then turning round to the West and saying, look, the opposition factions that you support are the ones who don't want to come to the table. So I think it's all part of that diplomatic game.
And Mamdouh, when you look at the situation from the Arabic world, this was published in the Guardian newspaper, a Western newspaper. Are there some cynical thoughts about the motivation of this publication?
Actually, many people in the Arab world think that there was a ceasefire before, like a small ceasefire, and it didn't work at all. So many people think that this ceasefire, this is not going to work at all from different point of view. And many people have no trust with the regime. Some people say that the regime he's only playing with time in order to actually have more time to actually gain more power on the ground.
Those of you watching, by the way, if you're tweeting as you watch, if you use the WHYS hashtag, you've got questions for any of our three guests here, we'll put them to them. Just a quick question, Sergei, on behalf of our viewers who are wanting to know exactly what the Deputy Foreign Minister of Russia is doing in Damascus. What does he hope to leave with? What's his goal?
Well, I think Russia is playing a very complicated game, an increasingly more complicated game in this conflict. Because from the very beginning of the Syrian conflict, I think the Russian authorities, they kind of projected their own version of Russian internal politics into their vision, into their interpretation of the Syrian conflict. They kept saying that they were against the regime change. And many people saw in this their fear of the Western interference into Russian politics. And hence, many liberal Russians were kind of apprehensive of their support of President Assad, because they thought that Putin, by staunchly supporting President Assad, Putin is saying that basically he's supporting himself. But now they, on the one hand, I think they see that they're scoring points against the West, that they were able to negotiate something that the West hasn't been able to negotiate for more than 2 years. But on the other hand, they kept saying, for example, I think President Putin surprised many people yesterday when he said that, in fact, he couldn't guarantee whether Assad would stand by his commitment, that it was for the Syrian regime to do this. And therefore, I think on the one hand, they're trying to show that they're in control, but on the other, they don't want to push it too much.
I'm not sure anyone's completely in control of this crisis at the moment. No, let's just put up a tweet here from Tony Karen. He's a journalist in New York. We can show it to you on the screen. He says, Syria regime call for ceasefire. The demand that Assad quit, there you go, hasn't been won on the battlefield. Unlikely to be won in talks. I mean, Jonathan, the problem is that every avenue you look at, whether you suggest that or the other, it's difficult to see anything that resolves this problem.
Well, at the moment it is. I mean, clearly, whilst, to be blunt, whilst there's still fight left in the various factions, and of course, as you heard earlier on one of those films, there aren't two sides to this conflict. It's very, very complicated, particularly on the opposition, the rebel side, whatever you want to call them. It is difficult. I think at the moment, there is a kind of a stalemate where President Assad remains in power in some key areas of the country, and several other groups, by and large, hold sway on the rebel side in other parts of the country. Now, whether that's a situation that can last for any length of time, we don't know. I mean, it's a kind of typical balkanization, as we'd call it, of the crisis, splitting up the country into small fiefdoms which are run by different groups, different factions. The Western-backed opposition very clearly insists that Assad must go as a condition for there being talks, and a whole transitional set of arrangements must be put in place. I don't think the Russians are particularly wedded to Mr. Assad himself out of any great love for his personality, but clearly they don't want to see this regime swept away en masse.
Presumably they want someone who'll listen.
And they want somebody who will perhaps listen to very much to their point of view.
All right, let's pull up another question here called from Rock and a Hard Place, posting on the BBC News website, writes, like the chemical weapons agreement, Assad may just be playing for time to restock and better organise his front lines. I mean, this is a line, Mamdouh, that we hear an awful lot, that even today when we hear that details have been handed over of the chemical weapons stockpile, all the while this is a tactic. Is that a widely held view among your audience?
Actually, yeah, many people actually think that it is actually a game from the government in order to actually because they're afraid that, because the government were afraid of the U.S. Hitting Damascus, so they're just doing this in order to actually stop them from that.
But there must come a point, and I think our viewers would like to know this, Jonathan, where it becomes impossible for the Assad regime to go back on the commitments it's making. How significant, for instance, is this list of details that's been handed over today?
Well, look, I think the first thing to say is that the Russian side, if you want to call it that, achieved its main purpose initially, which was to forestall American military strikes on Syria, and that they achieved pretty comprehensively. In terms of the working through of the agreement, well, how quickly are we going to know whether the Syrians are serious or not? That's the real question. They signed up to the Chemical Weapons Convention. tick number one. They've handed over some information today, certainly not complete information, and we know that from the organisation.
So today isn't the moment when we can go...
Well, we can't yet say that they are back. Just to give you a bizarre detail, if you sign up to the Chemical Weapons Convention, you actually are required to give an accounting of all your facilities and stocks and so on back to 1946, I think January of 1946, I'm not sure. It's something Britain had problems with, frankly, finding out all the information in the files and so on. Now, clearly what the Americans and the Russians would have said to the Syrians is we want an accounting by this weekend now of what you have that is usable, that you can get your hands on and can actually deploy. And we want a full accounting of that. But clearly getting it in the format that the OPCW, the organisation responsible for doing this, wants is going to take time. How comprehensive it is a huge question. Then you've got to have situations where inspectors can actually go in on the ground, tag stuff, verify what is in particular locations. Then you have the whole question of destruction and disposal. And of course, even while this is going on, the international community hasn't got all its ducks in a row yet either. The OPCW, the organisation in The Hague that's going to do this, it's got to figure out the details of its plan. Its Executive Council has to agree on that. They were to meet on Sunday. That's now to be postponed. Once they agree, the UN Security Council next week has to pass a resolution giving life to this whole proposal from the Americans and the Russians. So still a lot of hurdles to be got over yet.
Well, it sounds like President Assad has estimated it will take a year. It sounds like that might be an inaccurate guess. He also says it will cost $1 billion to get rid of the stockpile. Let's pull up another comment for our guest to respond to here on World Have You Say. Patrick Dehaan in New York has tweeted us, how can the Syrian government pursue a ceasefire if there are many other groups involved other than just the opposition and the government? I mean, let's hear the both of you talk about this, but from BBC Arabic's point of view, presumably it's hard for anyone to guarantee a ceasefire.
Actually, it is very hard. Even the opposition, but now they are actually fighting between each other. As we heard last couple of days, there was a Daesh, who's a group actually supported by the Al-Qaeda. They've actually took over Azaz, which is near Aleppo, and they were fighting the Syrian army. So there are many groups on ground involved, so it's very hard to actually...
But clearly the Russians are relatively optimistic they could deliver a ceasefire because they continue to say, let's find a diplomatic solution. So they must think that actually it is possible to get all the relevant groups to sign.
Well, I think they're playing it both ways because, again, they kept repeating for quite some time that the Syrian opposition is an increasingly complex phenomenon. And then there are what they call extremist elements with whom they wouldn't want to deal with. And in fact, I think some of their arguments against military strikes were based on the fact that they were saying, look, if you destroy Assad, then whom will get there, that it might get even worse. And this is something that had a lot of resonance with the Russian public, because, of course, if you talk about radical Islamist fighters, then they immediately remember about Chechnya and so on.
They have their own experiences.
Of course, the fascinating thing is it has great resonance among Western publics as well. I mean, this is the extraordinary thing. People are very concerned about what's going on in Syria, the horrors, the appalling loss of life and so on. But when it comes to actually doing something about it, Western opinion is very negative, and in large part, I think, because this argument from the Russians that Western governments are being naive and that actually action will objectively be working on the side of extremists, of the Al-Qaeda stripe, as it were. I think that's something that resonates very much here as well.
Okay, Jonathan, Sergey, thank you very much indeed. If you're just tuning in, Jonathan's our diplomatic correspondent. Sergey is from BBC Russian and Mamdouh is from BBC Arabic. They're taking any questions you may have about the situation in Syria. Let's have a look at a video that's come in from Ziad in Michigan. This is talking in particular response to what President Rouhani of Iran has had to say about the situation in Syria. It was an article he wrote in the Washington Post.
Onslaught of media interest in Dr. Assad and Mr. Rouhani, and certainly Mr. Putin recently wrote an editorial, as you know, in the New York Times, which sort of generated some controversy here in the United States. I think that's very consistent with Iranian policy. The Iranians have a very constructive policy regarding the situation in Syria. Yes, I think they would like to intervene and moderate the situation. That would not be surprising at all. How willing the West is to do that is something else. my feeling is that Mr. Cameron, Monsieur Hollande, and Mr. Obama really don't want anything more than to unseat our president in Damascus.
Ziad, thank you very much. So as if it weren't getting complicated enough, enter the president of Iran with a different message saying, let us resolve this in the region. Let's have a policy of constructive engagement. Just quickly from the three of you, is this a game changer or something that may be of consequence down the line, but in terms of resolving the Syrian crisis, perhaps not so much?
Look, it's potentially an important factor. I kind of said to somebody yesterday that what the Iranians are doing at the moment is the diplomatic equivalent of speed dating. They're sending out all these positive signals towards the West in advance of the UN General Assembly meeting next week. Look, clearly, one thing we won't go into, Iran has its own problems with the West over its nuclear program. We can talk about that in a minute if you want. But essentially, Iran is a key factor in Syria as well. It's one of Syria's few allies. It's a close ally of Hezbollah, which is fighting on the side of the Syrian regime. And Iran, as a player in the region, has a view of how the region should look, the geopolitics, how its interests should be addressed, and so on. So if it can be brought in with Western powers in a constructive way as part of a solution, how can that not be positive? The question is, are they really serious about doing this?
But also, does the West want them to come in as well?
That's another question.
A separate issue. What about the two of you quickly on the issue of Iran? Is this another factor, perhaps a good factor, that's opening
I think the Russian authorities, they met the Iranian statements with a cautious welcome, because I think now that they've come in so actively into the conflict, they want to be seen as key players, and they wouldn't want someone else to take that.
I think it is actually an important factor, because the Iranians were very stubborn when related to Syria. They've always said that they've never actually said there is actually a real revolution, or so I think it is a game changer as well.
All three of you, thank you very much indeed. I'm sure we'll be speaking to you again on World Have Your Say very soon. Remember, if you want to respond to anything we're talking about with reference to Syria, and we're also going to talk about Iran in more detail in a couple of minutes' time, we're on the hashtag WHYS.
No, I actually talking about it. Let me say something. No, I actually talking about it. Let me say something.
Hi, I'm Ross Atkins. Welcome back to World Have Your Say, where we're talking about the crisis in Syria, as we do almost every week on the programme. But we're going to take a little time now to reflect on the comments of the Iranian president. He has written an article in the Washington Post in which he's talked about constructive engagement with a number of the world's most powerful countries. And he's also set out how he believes that some of the big issues in the Middle East can be sorted out in the region. Some people are saying this is a sign there's a major shift in how the Iranian government approaches the rest of the world. Others saying it's just words, we're waiting for action. Let's talk about this with three guests who are joining us live. We've got Payman, who's an Iranian student in Pisa in Italy, who joins us live over the internet. Nugar Mortazavi is an Iranian journalist who's been based in Washington, D.C. for 11 years, and we're joined by our own Kazra Naji from BBC Persian. Nugar, let me start with you. When you sat down and read the Washington Post, did you think, I'm reading something of real significance, a moment where my country is changing?
I thought a PR firm was involved. It was unexpected. And from speaking to Iranians, I mean, jokes aside, from speaking to Iranians inside Iran and even Iranians across the world within the past less than 24 hours, it seems like change has already started. And I think if a response comes from the international community, it will be able to go on, because I don't think it's a one-way road. It's not just something that should be started and continued by Iran. I think some kind of response from the international community, especially from the West, and right now especially from the US, is also needed to get this ball rolling.
What about you, Payman?
Yes, of course. I mean, it was very interesting that Rouhani's article was published as a follow-up to, I would call it a follow-up to Putin's article addressing the American nation. I believe that not only Iran's foreign policy is changing, but also the issue of Syria is becoming very critical. So that's why Rouhani is addressing this issue in a different way, different from the former presidents.
And Kazra, what about your analysis? Do you think we've seen a big, significant shift?
I think we are witnessing a change. Rouhani is a moderate. He's come after 8 years of hardliners in power in Iran, and he knows diplomacy. He has been unofficially and quietly an emissary of Iran for many years, traveling very widely to various capitals in the world. He knows diplomacy, and he's one of the very few people. I know him for many years. For many years, he has believed that if we're going to solve Iran's problems, we have to solve our problems with the United States. And his article today in Washington Post is basically a message saying we're open for business, we are predisposed to direct talks with the United States.
So they're open for business, but the question is, can he offer the United States exactly what President Obama wants, which is a promise that there will be no nuclear weapon development and that the inspectors can get in? Nugar, are you convinced that he'll follow this up with actions?
I have a feeling, I mean, this is all still up for test and for seeing, but from what he has been saying and the sort of signals that are coming from the higher parts of the structure of power in Iran, it seems like there is a consensus as far as the Iranian power elite wanting to make a deal with the West or with the U.S. on the nuclear issue. Now, let's not forget that there's always hardliners on both sides. Like there are hardliners in the West, there are also hardliners in Iran who somehow seem to be sidelined right now by maybe people who are in power, but that might not be something sustainable. It might not go on. They're always ready for Rouhani to fail. So I don't think the window of opportunity for both sides is very big.
Well, let's pick up on that point. Kazra, explain the power dynamics here. Does the president have the means to do whatever he wants? Has he got the backing to follow this through?
He has the confidence of Iran's supreme leader, the top hardliner in Iran, and it matters that he does have the confidence of the supreme leader. He himself has been on the record in the last few days saying that he has full authority to negotiate over Iran's nuclear program. So I suppose, and as Negar just mentioned, there seems to be a consensus in Iran. For once, the top leaders in Iran are speaking more or less with the same voice. So if that's the case, then Mr. Rouhani is in a good position to make a start. How far he will go depends on things back at home in Iran and the hardliners, and how he has to win their support for anything that he will do in the future.
Kazra, Nugar and Peyman, don't go anywhere. We're going to have a short break and we'll come back and talk about this some more. And a question I want to ask you, and I'd like to ask all of you watching, is how do you think America should now respond to the overtures that this article in the Washington Post presents? Do you think it should offer a straight bat, or do you think, in fact, President Obama should offer an invitation to talk? Do let us know. The hashtag is WHYS. You can get us on facebook.com/worldhaveyourSay. We're going to take a very short break, then we'll come back and talk about the relationship between Iran and the US.
Let's just say something.
Hi, I'm Ros Atkins. Welcome back to World Have Your Say. Well, we're talking about this article that the president of Iran has written in the Washington Post. In it, he talks about a policy of constructive engagement. He says to understand some of Iran's policies, you have to comprehend the role of identity in how a country chooses its approach to the world. We're going to find out more about what he's been saying, and we're going to discuss how the watching world should respond. Well, I can see on the AFP Newswire that the French president's going to meet Hassan Rouhani on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly next week. Perhaps that's the first bit of evidence we've got that some of the Western powers will meet him halfway. We'll have to see. How do you think they should respond? Let us know through social media and also by giving us a call.
People are going to want to know. Let's just say something.
Well, I've been mentioning to you this article written by President Rouhani. Let's just show you a little bit of it, which we can put up on the screen for you here. He writes, I announced my government's readiness to help facilitate dialogue between the Syrian government and the opposition. And well, we've discussed whether that might be a helpful contribution to the situation in Syria or not. And also he goes on to say the unilateral approach, which glorifies brute force and breeds violence, is clearly incapable of solving issues we all face. I think we can safely say that is aimed at the United States. Now, let me introduce you to the new guests that are joining us. We have Mohsen Milani, an Iranian-born academic at the University of South Florida. Also, Meir Javedenfar, a lecturer in Iranian politics in Tel Aviv. He's Iranian and Jewish. And still with us is Nugar, live from Washington, D.C. Mohsen, let's start with you. How should America respond to these overtures from Iran?
I believe what Mr. Rouhani is offering is the best opportunity that I have seen in the past 25 to 30 years for establishing normal relations between the United States and Iran. I think it is a great opportunity. I think behind the charm offensive that everyone is talking about is a strategic decision made at the highest level of Iranian decision-making to somehow come out with an agreement to settle Iran's nuclear dispute with the West. The economic sanctions have truly hurt the Iranian economy. Iranian people are unhappy with the state of the economy. The 35 under generation, which is about 60% of the Iranian population, wants to be engaged with the rest of the world, and the Iranian leadership is aging. And therefore, I believe Ayatollah Khamenei, as well as President Rouhani, have calculated that it is high time for Iran to settle its nuclear dispute with the West. Therefore, I believe Washington should respond positively and quickly to the positive overtures coming from Iran's elected president.
But here's an interesting point, and you'll give us a perspective from Florida, and Nugar, you can give us a perspective from Washington, D.C. Tamez is tweeting us saying, if Obama engages with Iran, it will affect his popularity in the US. People will not want him to engage with the Iranians. Nugar, do you think that's true?
I think it will affect his popularity with a certain portion of the population in the U.S., just as it would affect a certain portion of the population in Iran. But I don't think that is the majority of the population. I don't think the people who voted for President Obama are for not negotiating or having dialogue or relations with the world, the same as the voters who brought Mr. Rouhani into power, the 18 million people, a lot of them young, progressive women, people from the urban areas, including other areas also, who voted for some kind of change, for decreased tensions within the country and in the international world with the international community, including the West, including America. And I don't think it would offend a big part of the population. I wouldn't worry about that.
Mohsen?
If you recall, during the debates about whether the U.S. should or should not attack Syria, somewhere between 62 to 65% of American electorate, of American population, favored peaceful resolution of the crisis in Syria. American people are tired of war. They have experienced two devastating and expensive wars in one decade. And I believe if President Obama can somehow reach an agreement with Iran, he will be remembered as a president who opened up the U.S. to Iran, exactly as President Richard Nixon is remembered as this great American president who saw the opportunity to open up the West to China and thus start the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union.
Well, President Nixon may be remembered for that. He's remembered for a couple of other things as well. But it's interesting that both of you say this is not an issue. If you're watching in the United States, would you approve of President Obama responding to this, well, I was going to say letter, it's an article in the Washington Post, but it feels like a letter to America saying, let's engage, let's talk about this. Is that what you want your president to do? We're on the hashtag WHYS. Now let's go to Tel Aviv and speak to Meir, who's been listening to all of this. What's your analysis of what the Iranian president has had to say?
Well, to be honest with you, I think the article is important, but to me the signals that there may be change in the pipeline came from before, from a number of actions from President Rouhani. The first was his tweet, which some people denied, but I think it actually was his tweet, congratulating the Jewish people for the new year, for Rosh Hashanah. This was followed by Javad Zarif, his foreign minister, who also did that. That's unprecedented in the last decade in Iranian politics. This was also then was followed by Rouhani speaking recently with the Revolutionary Guard. Basically, he's trying to mollify them by saying, yes, you can be part of the process, by staying out of the politics. You should help with the economy, but stay out of the politics. He's basically, it seemed to me that he's getting the buy-in of the Revolutionary Guard for the changes that are on the way. Then we saw recently the release of political prisoners. I think Rouhani, I think it's safe to assume that he pressured the supreme leader to do this in order to give him mandate. So when he goes to the UN, people actually will talk to him about the nuclear program rather than Iran's abuse of human rights. And when you put all these signals together, I think these show us that, yes, Rouhani has been trying to create the mandate and the groundwork in order to bring some change. Now we've got this op-ed in Washington Post, which is his way of trying to mollify the American side. And now I think we have to wait and see what he can actually deliver.
Well, you mentioned the international stage, but you also refer to what's happening in Iran. Let's talk about that a little bit more. Is it your, Nuga, excuse me, is it your expectation that it becomes easier to express yourself, for instance, in Iran, easier to express political opposition in Iran? Are you anticipating that?
Definitely. I mean, look at the past few days, some of the very prominent political prisoners. I would say the most famous and internationally popular political prisoner, Nasrin Sotoudeh, the human rights lawyer, was released. That's not a coincidence. That's a very important signal. Look at the newspapers. Look at what newspapers are writing. In the past 8 years, it wasn't easy for newspapers, especially for reformist newspapers, to publish anything. It wasn't easy for them to have even President Khatami on their front cover or even to discuss a lot of news about former President Rafsanjani. Now they're on cover every single day. There's, speaking of political prisoners, on the cover of reformist newspapers. These are unprecedented in Iran, especially in the past 8 years. So I think change has started, and I think it will be sustainable. I don't think this is just something that will die out soon.
Nuga, you're in Washington, D.C. Lots of you watching around the world are getting in touch as well, from Syria, Uganda, Tanzania, Somalia, Cambodia, Egypt and Libya. Thank you very much indeed. Do keep getting in touch. Let me just go back to you, Meher, in Tel Aviv, because we're hearing a lot of optimism from all three of you. But let's not forget how far apart Iran is from Israel and from America. Do you really think that that gap can be bridged in a meaningful way?
The gap can be bridged because the Iranian and the Israeli people don't have any problems. We've never been at war. Israel nor Iran is occupying any of the territories. I think the problem has been that the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei, who is more hardline than some of the neoconservatives we see in the United States. He's tried his best to keep a distance, to keep America at bay. I actually think some of the anti-Israel statements, which includes Holocaust denial by the Supreme Leader himself, their goal is to make it more difficult for the United States to get close to Iran. However, nowadays, it's very difficult for him to keep America away. The sanctions and also the Arab Spring in this region have shaken the confidence of the regime, that they're not immune to what is happening outside of the borders. And I think he's very reluctantly now giving a leeway to Rouhani in order to save the regime, because the red line for the regime is the economy, and that's a very important red line. What we don't know is how much actual mandate for change President Rouhani has.
And that's an interesting point, because a lot of the comment pieces that I've seen online today have been suggesting that the main driver of all of this is that the Iranian economy is suffering to such a great degree that Iran has to shift its position in order to try and get sanctions lifted. I'm not saying that's definitely what's happening, but a lot of analysts are looking at it that way. All three of you, thank you very much. Mohsen, Meher and Nuga, we appreciate you joining us live here on World Have Your Say. Stay with us because we're not going anywhere. We're going to talk about when it's appropriate for Muslim women to wear the veil. It's been a huge issue in the UK this week. We'll get into that in a couple of minutes' time.
No, I talking about it. Let me say something. No, I talking about it. say something.
Hi, I'm Ros Atkins. Welcome back to World Have Your Say. Well, we've talked about the crisis in Syria. We've talked about Iran. We're going to spend some time on a big issue that's been playing out here in the UK over the past few days. A judge decided that a Muslim woman who would normally wear a veil had to remove that veil to give evidence in a trial. That made a lot of news, created a lot of discussions, and now we've had teachers discussing if it's appropriate for a veil to be worn, and also hospitals saying their position on whether nurses should be able to wear a veil. Now, the most popular newspaper in the UK, the one which sells the most copies, is The Sun, and it put this issue on its front page. As judge orders woman to uncover face, The Sun demands vital reforms. Ban veils in schools, courts and hospitals. Let employers decide if it's okay in the workplace. Ban them in airports, banks and secure areas, but you can wear them in streets and parks. So that's what The Sun is suggesting. Let me introduce you to a couple of guests to talk about this. Marina Parnanen is training to be an Islamic scholar, and Zubaydah Limbada is from an organisation called Connect Justice, a social justice organisation. Both are joining us live from Birmingham. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Marina, perhaps you could go ahead, and then Zubaydah, feel free to pick up. Marina, in what circumstances do you think you ought to remove your veil?
Well, I've been wearing the veil for a few years now, and I've, in that time, had to pass through airport security on a number of occasions. And obviously, at that time, the airport staff need to identify who I am. So I've been very happy to lift my veil and show my face to whoever has been checking my identity. Similarly, in other situations, for example, in the court case where the woman was asked to show her identity while she was giving her testimony, I don't particularly see any problem with her lifting her veil in that situation. I think, for example, what The Sun was suggesting about banning them in all situations in hospitals, in all situations in schools, this is, I think, it's a little bit kind of hyping up the situation, is trying to build up hysteria. I don't really think that's necessary at all.
Zubaydah?
I think this is an interesting discussion that we're having, because whilst things are taking place in the around the veil, there are also international discussions taking place. So, for example, in Canada, in Quebec state, the government is currently discussing something called the Quebec Values Charter. And again, it's following similar discussions in terms of what's happened in France, and about the public space where women who wear a veil, or people who wear a Jewish yarmulke, public kind of faith symbols would be banned. And so in that context, in terms of the burqa, I think it's being simply because the number of women who actually wear the veil is very small. I welcome the debate, and I think it's a healthy sign of a healthy democracy and society. But we have to be very careful in terms of the proportionality of the debate, and look at what we're also avoiding. So, for example, are we discussing society's fears of people being covered up, and also other issues about multiculturalism, about immigration? So what exactly are we talking about?
I'm interested in that word fear, because this has come up a great deal in the debates, because some people feel that a woman wearing a veil could create fear, could intimidate. Let's see a comment from Alison Pearson, a very well-known newspaper columnist. She writes for the Daily Telegraph and says, "How free is an 11-year-old who only sees her city through a letterbox slit and who is obliged to dress in a way that intimidates people?" Marina, do you accept that the way you dress may intimidate?
Well, I can understand how some people might find it strange or different. You know, the letterbox comment that she just made, that kind of resonates with me. I've actually had someone in the street, you know, insult me in such a way, referring to my face veil as a letterbox. I don't think it's very conducive to this debate to be making those kind of statements. I really... I find that the veil is, for me, very liberating. I don't see, you know, she's saying that this 11-year-old, she's kind of cut off from society. I really don't see that as being the case. Just this morning, I went to a clinic with my small son, and the receptionist, she just came up and started talking to me about my son, about his health and everything. And we were having a very normal, very nice conversation, and she did not seem fazed by my veil at all.
So she may not have been fazed by it, but Zubaydah, do you think that some people will be intimidated? And if they are, is it their problem or the woman who's wearing the veil's problem?
I think it's, I think there's lots of things that intimidate me. I'm fearful of big men in biker jackets with a punk hair, for example, that may intimidate me. But at the same time, there needs to be a proportionality of where real and perceived fears feed into the discussion of what the state should get involved in, i.e. should they ban women wearing the veil, which other European countries have done, and then where people feel their needs need to be addressed. So, for example, within the NHS, in the health service in the UK, I think it's right that the NHS is taking a considered decision in terms of, for example, how appropriate dress and how patient contact, i.e. making the patient feel secure, having face-to-face contact with the doctor or the consultant. I think these are the nuances that need to be discussed.
So they are the nuances, but Zubaida, I'd like to understand what you think about those nuances. When you go to a hospital, do you want to see the face of the nurse who's treating you?
Yes, I would. Yes.
You would.
Yeah,
and can you and Marina, can you understand that?
Yes, of course. You know, actually, my husband works as a doctor in the NHS, and we've discussed this issue in some detail. And I can understand how, obviously, in a healthcare setting, there needs to be some kind of rapport, a relationship that is built up between a patient and a doctor. And that's why I feel that, of course, the GMC, and similarly with the teaching profession, they can lay out their own guidelines about the uniforms that they think that their staff should wear. However, having a blanket ban, for example, in hospital, I don't think that's a very wise move at all, because in the medical profession, patient confidentiality and the patient's right to autonomy is very highly held. So if a woman who, just because she's going into hospital, was told, you know, as a patient, you'd have to remove your veil, I really don't think that would be fair at all.
Most suggestions I've heard is that staff who wear veils would have to take it off rather than patients, but I appreciate there are lots of different views on this. Let me pull up one more comment. Alison Phillips, I mean, every newspaper has been having their economists reflect on this in the UK. This is from the Daily Mirror. Alison Phillips writes, what reason can there be to demand that a woman show her face everywhere she goes other than fear? And isn't that a good point, Zubaida, that if we remove the fear from the equation, a woman ought to be able to wear anything she wants?
Absolutely. And in the same way that the discussion takes on with some people sort of saying that these women are oppressed, etc., etc. My mother wears a veil, for example. It's her choice. And I think it's about the woman's choice, anyone's choice to wear what they want. And it's not for the state to enforce liberating someone or someone feeling that these women are oppressed, because in my eyes, if you start to ban things, it's now the state that's now oppressing the freedom of choice of people wearing what they want as well.
And just quickly before we wrap up, Marina, we've only got a few seconds, but are there any circumstances when you take your veil off, or do you wear it from the moment you get up in the morning to the moment you go to bed?
Well, of course, I don't wear it inside the house. I wear it in situations where, if I'm outside, I'm in contact with men who are not related to me. That's kind of what the Islamic virtue is in it. So obviously, I don't wear it at home when I'm playing with my child, for example, or in the bath. And I've had people ask me, oh, do you wear that in the shower?
Well, you say it's obvious, but it's also important to clear these things up, because perhaps people don't understand. Very good to speak to both of you. Zubaida and Marina, thank you very much indeed for your time. All right, that's it for World Have Your Say this week on BBC World News. We'll be back on BBC World Service Radio in an hour, but for the moment, thanks for your company. I'll speak to you soon. Goodbye.
Let me say something.